Yeah, we here. All right. This is ESP. We in the house. All the lies. We're going to look at some lies today. Yes. This is ESP Speaks. Get your watch parties together. Call a friend. Grab a beer. Glass of wine. Come on in and visit with ESP. It's going to be a great show. Got a lot to talk about. So grab a pen and a piece of paper. We're going to learn something today. We're going to talk about things you never heard before. So come on in. Once again, this is ESP Speaks. We in the house. Oh yeah. Got a great show for you tonight. Start your watch party. Come on in and share us with a friend. Yes. All right. Let's get things started. We're gonna chime in with the coconut song because that's what my tech calls it, the coconut song. Just to let you know we're ready tonight. So glad to see you. Yes, good evening. I'm so happy to see you guys again. And some of my favorite people popping up. LaFonda, that's my girl right there. LaFonda, we had fun last night. LaFonda was with us on The Real Discussion with Rock Logic and Rock and the crew. We all played Jeopardy last night and LaFonda won. So, you never know. That's $50 that she won. And you never know what's going to happen when you're on The Real Discussion or ESP Speaks or The Raw Discussion or any one of our shows. But I'm just so happy to be with you guys this evening and be back. And this is going to be a very different kind of show because we're going to be learning a lot tonight. So grab a pen and a piece of paper. And the name of our show is Our Story in History. We're going to talk about some things that you weren't taught in school, some things that we need to know about. And we're going to kind of jump right in. For years, children of color, adults of color, we've been subject to only one side and one perspective of American history. So on today's show, we intend to bring some light to the lesser spoken about achievements of our people. And let's lift up some of the enhancements of our community and really get into that, especially looking at the fact that we're being told that we have to send our children back into a petri dish, which people have not figured out yet. And just on a side note, I don't understand if you're letting prisoners out of prison because they are in an 8x8 cell for their protection. You want me and several 100,000 parents in New York City, millions of parents around the world, as a matter of fact, to send their children and have them exist for 8 hours in basically a 6x6 foot space. This makes absolutely no sense to me, but I digressed. I'm greeting you this evening with peace and love, and I thank you for hanging in there with me. I'm going to take a minute to talk and tell about our sponsors. We are sponsored by Breathe CPR. They're located at 892 Wyckoff Avenue in Brooklyn. Their number is 718-497-3277. And we also have a sponsor, which is Cartier Designs, which is located at cityphases.com. They do all of our t-shirts and a new line of masks that we have out that we're going to have available for you soon. Also at Boardwalk Global Media, which is our mother company, which is 908-242-6234. At Boardwalk Global Media, we also do podcasts. So if you want to do a podcast of your own, or if you have a brilliant idea and want to become part of our podcast line, please do let us know. Special shout outs to La Mosaic Creations, and that's our Captain Leslie. La Mosaic specializes in custom designs. She does dolls, she does woodwork, she does all kinds of stuff. In fact, if you go to our fan page at ESP Speaks, you'll find a whole folder that says La Mosaic Creations in it, and you'll get an idea of some of the stuff that she does. And if you have an idea or a drawing, I'm sure that she can just pick it up and create it for you as well. So take a look at La Mosaic Creations. I also want to give a ultra special shout out to two of the factions that work very closely with us in hip hop, and we with them. The Universal Hip Hop Museum with our brothers LG and Rocky Bucano. They recently had a series of stamps that were released by the United States Post Office, 5 designs on hip hop. Did you ever think that you'd see that? But congratulations to them. But I really want you to know that they have the wonderful Hip Hop Museum up at 65 East 149th Street in Bronx, New York. Their number is 347-454-2793. They're also at www.uhhm.org. You really do need to take a look at the museum when they opened after this COVID thing. I think they're in phase 4 and actually getting ready to move into reopening. Take the kids. It's a wonderful experience. It's like going back into the 80s and reliving your childhood if that was your time. Also, I'd like to say shout out to Al Pizarro over at Hip Hop Boulevard. He's taking care of our legends of hip hop, and he's doing so many wonderful things over there. His website is at www.hiphopboulevard.net. You might want to take a wander over there and take a look at what he's doing with the pioneers as well. And once again, you are listening to ESP Speaks and watching ESP Speaks. at Facebook Live. We do exist. If you cannot watch the entire show, we are on several different platforms. We're on Anchor, Spotify, Breaker, Overcast, Pocket Cast, Radio Public, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Twitch, and soon YouTube Live as well. So you'll have a simulcast on that. But if you can't watch, you can go to YouTube Live. And YouTube is the only one that has all of our shows and visual content, whereas the other podcasts have just the audio podcasts. We're also on Instagram and Google Podcast as well. If you want to give us a call tonight, we're on 908-242-6234. And we're on Instagram at ESP Real Talk. On Facebook, we're at ESP Speaks on the fan page. And if you want to send us an email, we're at espspeaks@gmail.com. Remember, if you go to the YouTube page, please click the bell to subscribe and send us a little note and let us know that you were there. All right, so that rolls us back over to Rocky. Are we good? Because we have a wonderful guest in the background. Do we have him on hold? All right, ladies and gentlemen, I want to introduce to you a very, very special guest. I'm extremely excited to have him on. He is the president of BTY and an avid producer of youth and educational programs throughout New York and New Jersey. He's an American historian and the lead marketing executive for FAMDO. He is the one, the only, Professor Aaron Howard.
Well, what an introduction. Thank you very much.
Good evening, good evening, good evening. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. It's so good to hear you. And I do appreciate you all having me on tonight, too.
We appreciate having you here as well. I'm so excited about this because this is such an important show. I'm going to pose you with several questions throughout the course of our interaction here. And you know what? Let's stop. Let's take things a little differently tonight. You are
whatever you want to do, sure.
You are such a wealth of information, and I so enjoy talking to you. I know that you have a pattern by which you want your expressions to happen. So I'm going to sit back, and rather than ask you questions, I'm just going to open up the floor to you and let you run with it, because a lot of the things that we've discussed have come across on a chronological line. So I don't want to interrupt your flow. I want you to give us the information that you'd like us to have, because once again, everything we've talked about has been so important over the last couple of weeks that I just want to be able to fit everything in there. There is a talk element here where I don't want to be the talker. I want our audience to call in and be able to speak to you. So for the first 20 minutes to a half an hour, we're going to let you run with it.
Oh, okay.
And then if I have any...
And let me say this too. Feel free to interject.
I will.
Both yourself and Rock, feel free. And if I, might have a tendency to ramble, so feel free to interject, ask questions, and whatever you guys want to do, I'm fine with it.
Well, rambling is never something that I associate with you, but we'll be here. We'll ask some questions, because I do have several questions of my own, but I want to hear what you have to say first. Then our listeners want to hear you as well. So without further ado, I'm going to shut up and give you the floor. Aaron Howard, ladies and gentlemen.
All right. And again, I really, really, really appreciate being here. And I'm really flattered by the term being that I'm designated with on the show as a historian. Basically, what I am is I'm a lover of history. I've always been really, really enamored with history, both American history, world history, from the time I was a kid. So that was just something I kind of naturally progressed to. And currently, I, in addition to running a nonprofit association, generally, basically working with children, which has always been a passion of mine. I also teach various history and government courses at my local community college in New Jersey. And one of the things I always say about history is that it gives us kind of a roadmap as to where we're going and where we are today. Mm-hmm. And as the old saying goes, if you don't know your past, you're doomed to repeat it. And by studying our past, we have a good idea of how we got here and where we may be headed. And that's one of the things I really like about history, is being able to kind of imagine myself within that time period, thinking about some of the people who were involved during that time, the decisions that they had to make, and just trying to think how, just try to imagine what it would have been like living in that time. Having said that,
what early developments regarding blacks were made pre-U.S. Constitution? Because that seems to be a big point of interest right now, especially with all the happenings that are currently happening. I think we need to step back a little further to see how we got here. So again, the developments regarding blacks, which were made pre-U.S. Constitution.
Right. Good question. I'm glad you started there, because it's always good to start from the beginning. And if you follow the history, where we are today with the issues of social and racial injustice, none of that is new. In fact, that's at the very core, as I'm sure a lot of you and a lot of listeners know. That actually happened from the very beginning of the formation of the country. But even pre-Constitution, as you said, generally, not only American history, but all history, and that's the thing everyone has to remember, it's not an exact science. Generally, history is the best information that can be gathered, and kind of through process of deduction, determining what's accurate, what's true, and trying to base it from there.
Right. Because, of course, history is a pack of lies.
Yeah, it could be. And that's what I was leading to now.
Yeah, history is a pack of lies about events that never happened, told by people who weren't there. So we really don't know.
History, like the saying goes, to the victor goes the spoils. The victor gets to write the history.
Exactly.
So the history is always going to show the people who won the war, the people who's in power, in the best light. So the victors get to choose the heroes, and they get to choose the villains. And so you always got to keep that in mind when you're studying history, is that, and use your own best judgment a lot of times. Because a lot of things are debatable. And historians, credible ones anyway, will tell you that this subject is open for some debate with some things. But generally try to look for what's more credible than the other, and you go with that.
So speaking of debatable, Professor Howard, African leaders in the slave trade. Tell me about how their role with the African leaders play in the slave trade. And also, I'm not sure if you answered the pre-Constitution question yet, but I'm kind of just throwing them at you because I'm chomping at the bit to hear what you got to say on these.
Okay. All right. Well, let me answer that within the last question first, and I can always go back to the pre-Constitution. There's a pretty interesting history there as well. With regards to how the role African leaders played in the trade, in the slave trade, worldwide, well, I shouldn't say worldwide, more between the Western Europeans and as well as the Western Africa and in North America, the slave trade was incredibly lucrative to offer. We talked about the Middle Passage, that triangle going from Europe down to Africa and over to North America. Each place was generating a lot of revenues. Each place. As far as the answer question, as far as the African rulers, they were involved as well. Mm-hmm. And there's some interesting distinctions. The Europeans are basically bringing their boats down to Africa and working with certain, generally people along the coast, the slave traders, the European slave traders rarely went inland. Mm-hmm. They pretty much parked their boats out, and the slaves were pretty much brought to them. Generally, it was from conquering African tribes or nations over the defeated parties. That's generally what made up the slaves. Mm-hmm. And most of the African rulers along the coast, I should say most, but the ones along the coast, were participating. And they were trading pretty much with the Europeans' guns, textiles, and things of that nature for their captured slaves. The big distinction is, as I'm sure everybody knows, slavery has been around since biblical days. And it was no different in Africa either, as well as a lot of European nations. There were, slavery through the Romans and all throughout history, there's been slaves. The distinction is, particularly in Africa, they didn't envision the brutality that the slaves that they were selling to the white people were going to endure. Slavery at a lot of these Western African countries, slaves pretty much acted as servants. They were household servants. They were almost part of the family. They had rights. They were able to marry. They were able to raise families. They were able to still have money to spend themselves. That was the concept of slavery to a lot of the Africans who were dealing with it. They didn't necessarily have a good idea of what awaited the other Africans who they were selling into bondage to the white Europeans, because the slavery that took place in North America and also South America, I should say, as well as the Caribbean, was nothing like the slavery that an African at that time would have been familiar with. And I hope so. That's one of the things. But there was, in particular, one empire, one African nation at that time that didn't participate, and that was Benin. The Kingdom of Benin. And the Benin Empire near southern Nigeria ran from like 1180 through 1897. They did not participate in the slave trade, and that's pretty notable. And they were one of the biggest and most powerful nations at that time on the continent, and they did not participate. The Benin Empire. And generally, the African leaders or rulers, they would collect taxes on foreign merchants. They controlled the capture and the sale of slaves. But, during this time, over the course of history, there were about 10 million Africans exported from Africa over to the Americas. 10 million. And you could imagine what that sort of transplanting of men, women, and children did to even African society. It caused a major disruption in the whole idea of their own textiles being able to sell. They were trading people for guns, which encouraged further growth of slavery, because now they were out arming their rivals. It created militarized states for the sole purpose of capturing slaves. So there was, it was valuable to all three parties, the Euros, the Africans, as well as the colonists of North America. But it really caused a real disruption too.
But at any point, Professor, at any point were there rebellions from the people leaving Africa? Did any point?
Well, that's a very good question. There were rebellions once they hit the mainland, but on African soil, as they were boarding the boat, there really weren't, and there weren't many rebellions even on the boat. And the reason why is this: the captured Africans didn't necessarily have any sense of kinship necessarily with other Africans who were captured. They were from neighboring tribes, though they might not have been neighboring at all. They could have never seen each other before, or each other's people before. So there's really no feeling of kinship between them. Oftentimes they didn't speak the same language, which was kind of managed very professionally by the Europeans in separating people who might have been captured from the same village and separating them and putting them in different areas on different boats. So that way they couldn't conspire, they couldn't scheme to rebel because they didn't even speak the same language.
So that was done on purpose.
Yes. Yes. So that really cut down on any sort of rebellions. And the same thing happened once those African slaves hit the North Americas. If there was any association with by language or religion or anything, they by design, they really separated them. They were really separated. So rebellions, particularly leaving to get on the boat and on the boats themselves, very little rebellion, but there were rebellions once they did hit the,
okay.
Like we're probably familiar with Nat Turner, and Vesey, Benrick Vesey, and a few others. But there certainly were rebellions. Yeah.
Okay, so let's progress a little further ahead.
Mm-hmm.
What happened after the Emancipation Proclamation and the slave amendments?
Okay. With the freeing of the slaves, even though it wasn't necessarily all the slaves, it was basically certain slave states were freed through the Emancipation Proclamation, but it still was a historic event. Basically, what happened is the big thing that the Africans wanted at that time, and you got to remember during the time period, this is what I was trying to explain earlier.
Mm.
If you put yourself in the time that was going on, and we're talking like the 1700s, particularly during the time of the American Revolution, the Black Africans that were brought here were hearing their white owners talking a lot and preparing to fight for freedom and liberty. So they were hearing all of those terms and thinking that, this is going to be something for us too. Mm-hmm. At some point, freedom and liberty. I guess at the very beginning, they didn't realize the hypocrisy of the colonists, but they were hearing them talk so passionately about being free and being free from the oppressive leadership of the British that they thought there would be something in it for them as well, mm-hmm. Which obviously there really wasn't. But after the Emancipation Proclamation, slaves was freeing of the slaves. And one of the first things the slaves newly freed Africans wanted to do was to vote. And that was one of the things they really wanted to be involved in the politics of the land. They wanted the same sorts of rights as everyone else. So one of the first things they did is Black folks really right away began to vote. The elections in the late 1860s, following the Civil War, you saw like an 80%, sometimes 90% voter participation level, voter turnout amongst Blacks. And the slave trade was so valuable during that time that in a lot of these southern states, there were more Black Africans than there were white slave owners and white people, through the process of importing it in, and more so even from the process of just natural reproduction. So when they had the opportunity to vote after the Civil War, they turned out in droves, and particularly in South Carolina and Louisiana in the late 1860s following the Civil War, you had Black majority assemblies in the state legislatures, particularly in South Carolina and Louisiana and a couple of the other Confederate states, surprisingly, where you had Black people turning out and voting, and they were winning all sorts of offices.
I need to stop you there, because that was a mouthful. So this is not something that we're taught here. You are telling me that the same rights that we had been fighting for in 1968, fighting and dying for, we had already been doing in the 1700s, you said?
This was the 1800s. Yeah, the Civil War ended around 1865. So right around in the late 1860s, early 1870s, Blacks held positions in the South and Confederate states, things like locally, like sheriffs, county magistrates, Supreme Court justices, U.S. senators. Black political power was very, very big at that time, because right away, Black folks went out and started voting. And and interestingly enough, and that's why I say, if we just follow our history, well, it'll help us so much. Mm-hmm. As you might imagine, in those states, and we have to be called progressive even now. And this is some of the things they did, particularly in South Carolina. The white people opposed and called them the Congo Convention, because the Blacks pretty much ruled the legislature in the state, so they called them the Congo Convention. They outlawed racial discrimination in theaters, hotels, and restaurants. This was all in the 1860s, right after the Civil War.
Wow.
Instituted public welfare programs, built hospitals, orphanages, established boards of health, provided food for the poor. Public school systems were set up during that time, all within right away. As soon as they gained the right to vote right after the war, the Black folks were out there voting. It started and taking advantage of their numbers, which had counted for nothing during slavery because, unfortunately, while they, in some instances, they were outnumbered, they were obviously outgunned, which is another reason why and the whole idea at that time was, as you saw the white colonists saw the growth of the African population in North America, and I'll speak specifically for North America for this instance. As they saw the population growing, obviously you would think too that they started to become worried. They started to become worried about being overthrown because there were rebellions. Nat Turner had a rebellion. Vinroy Dusty. There were rebellions all over the place. But again, blacks didn't have guns at that time, though. But one of the things that really, so a big part of slavery here became a process of how do you control, who in sheer numbers. Right now, I believe the black population in the U.S. is somewhere around 13%. It was 40 or 50% or more in some of these black cities, and generally speaking, it was about 20% overall. So there was a larger black population percentage-wise back during slavery times than there really is now. So as many black people as you see now at 13%, there were more back in those days. There were actually more of us proportionally than
that's staggering information. That really is staggering information. Okay, so
go ahead, sure.
No. You continue on because I'm in awe. Go ahead.
Let me see, what were we talking about? So blacks really turned out and voted, and they started winning elections almost right away, sheriff, county magistrate, Supreme Courts. And as you might imagine, they made a lot of progressive improvements, including school systems. One of the things, interestingly enough, that they didn't do even then, and they were making all sorts of other changes, they didn't do the land redistribution that a lot of blacks were calling for. So, as you know, we didn't get our 40 acres and a mule. That never happened. That didn't happen. But we did make a lot of progress during those times.
So where did it all go wrong? Or where did it not go right?
This is what happened. As you might imagine, those Confederates who just lost the war were pissed. As you see, one day these black folks are pretty much just your mules and work animals, and now they're holding high offices. So that's when you had the start of the Black Codes, of Jim Crow, the Ku Klux Klan. That's when you started to have those. So they saw that by the power of the vote, and that's why, I'm going to go off on a little tangent here. I say I might ramble, but people who say voting doesn't matter, this proves it right here, because these black people were right out of the Civil War. And before white people knew what hit them, we were electing ourselves to office and making the changes immediately. We came right into office. There was none of that, well, we're going to work across the aisle. They came right in and started putting together a progressive agenda. White people were scared to death, as you could imagine, seeing this.
So question for you. I'm sorry to interrupt, because
that's okay, please.
The common thought process is the Ku Klux Klan was born to control slaves. But with what you're saying here, with us already being freed and voting and being empowered, and now the Ku Klux Klan is coming into the communities and destroying, was it really that they were chasing us down as slaves, or was really that they were holding us down as free men? Which one?
The Ku Klux Klan and these terrorist-type organizations came to power specifically for two reasons: to segregate themselves from blacks, and also to disenfranchise us, to take away our vote. Now, by the 13th, 14th, and 5th Amendments, we were freed. We had the right to vote, and the Constitution was going to judge us as all equal under the eyes of the law. They pretty much wanted to go around that because they saw what the power of the vote was. So one of their main agendas was to take away that power of the vote, and that's where you get the Klan scaring people from running from elections, instituting black codes to keep black people from voting. Things like the poll tax. If you couldn't afford to pay a tax, you couldn't register to vote. Stripping black people of of their voting rights, or if they were convicted of petty crimes. So any kind of, gathering or loitering would be a crime, and bam, you have no more right to vote. Giving literacy tests, making them read parts of the Constitution and explaining it. Things that weren't done to white people at that time. In fact, white people had what they are called the grandfather clause, where your grandfather could vote. That means you could vote. And of course, black people who were just freed, obviously their grandfather wasn't voting. So they came up with all different kinds of ways to circumvent the amendments.
Okay.
And so, and because they saw the gains that we were making almost right away.
That's
almost
incredible.
right away, we started making gains. Yeah. So the Ku Klux Klan kind of came took to power after the end of the Civil War, because they saw the gains we were making, and they were dead set on stopping that. On stopping that agenda that we're putting out.
That's really incredible, because from what you just told me kind of wipes away several lies, because as I said before, we were always told that the Klan was chasing after slaves. We were free when they were fully activated in what they were doing.
When they really came to power, their thing was to stop us from voting. Okay. Disenfranchisement was a main agenda of the Ku Klux Klan, was to segregate and to, more importantly, to stop our voting rights. And they couldn't stop the voting rights because it was in the Constitution, so they went around the law with the things I just talked about. Poll taxing, literacy tests, those sorts of things to keep us from voting.
Let's talk about the Constitution in itself. And if you hear it clicking in the phone, it's because my text phone is tied into the board, and the clicking is what we're hearing with him typing.
Okay.
With regard to voting, and I'm losing trend of thought here. If we're voting and we're in power and we're in office, I've heard it rumored on several occasions. Obviously, it's not a rumor because I know you're going to blow me away. Barack Obama was not the first Black American president, was he?
Well, yes and no. And I did some investigation in this. Before, Barack Obama was the first Black president after our U.S. Constitution was ratified, which was like in the late 1780s. Prior to that, with the 13 original colonies, they still, while they kind of saw themselves then as, people from New York saw themselves as New Yorkers, not Americans. People from North Carolina saw themselves as North Carolinians, not Americans. People from Georgia saw themselves as Georgians, not Americans, voting. So during that time period, while they kind of, different colonies did have an organization called the, not American, I think it was the Continental Congress, North Carolina.
Aaron, hold on a second. We're getting a feedback. Hold on.
People, okay, I'm sorry, saw themselves as Georgians, not Americans, voting. So during that time period, while they kind of, different organization called the,
Okay, we're having a little technical difficulty, so Aaron, just hang in there. Don't lose the trend of thought. There's just something happening on one of our boards. It's not you. We're watching something happening on one of our boards here, and he's trying to correct it. Do we have it? Happening on boards. It's not you. Okay, there's a feedback issue. I'm so sorry. Okay, there you go. We're better now. I'm so sorry.
Okay, that's fine. That's okay. What was I going to say? Oh, yeah, the first Black president. There was a gentleman, I think probably who you're referring to is a guy named John Hanson. He was president of what at that time, before the Constitution, before we were a United States, while we were still originally 13 colonies, he was president of the United States in the Congress, which was pretty much the highest office in terms of combining all of the 13 colonies together. As some sort of, while it wasn't a formal combination of the 13 colonies, this was the organization that met and assembled and kind of discussed, where they were going, because they were all pretty much in the same boat. They were colonists, eventually talking about breaking away from British rule. Mm-hmm. And this assembly actually led to the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. But during that time period, a guy named John Hanson, at around from right about from 1781 rather. And the Constitution was ratified in the late 1780s. So in the early 1780s, John Hanson was actually president of the United States in the Congress. And that was pretty much the governing body, if they're as be that as it was at that time. So, and there's, as I mentioned earlier, some things are up for debate. One of them is whether he was actually a black man or not. And there's varying debates about whether he was, but I think the overwhelming consensus that I was able to gather is that he was probably biracial or mixed at that time. Anything, if he had any drop of black blood, he was certainly considered black. So to answer your question, yeah, he probably was. He could be called as the first black president of the United States, but it was before there's some debate because we weren't necessarily the United States at that time.
Understood. And you actually rolled me into my next question, because whether they consider you a black person or not. So let's go back to the Constitution, because in the Constitution, there are clear wordings that are very descriptive as to where black people fall in this whole structure that they've written. So can we talk a little bit about that? Because we're considered chattel up to this day. Some of these words are still in the Constitution and effective by law. So can we speak on that a little bit?
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up too. The Constitution is, even as myself as a black man and reading the Constitution, I suggest everybody read the Constitution. You can do it in about an hour. You don't have to do it all in one sitting. I tell my students, in fact, right away in some of the courses, I taught government and politics courses. That's the first thing we do is read and discuss the Constitution. An incredible document. And I have to give them a lot of credit, because they're something that was written and ratified in the 1780s. It's only been, 27 changes or amendments. And that's what we live by today. But to answer your question, yeah, we nowhere in the Constitution does it say blacks or slaves. It was written, and it was written by lawyers, and that's the thing. When you read the Constitution, it's a legal document, and it was written by lawyers, and you can tell as you start to read it, it's very lawyerly. But no, we weren't considered people, and you probably could be referring to the 3/5 clause, that we were counted as 3/5 of a person, and that's pretty much what that came from. That pretty much came from the reasoning of. As the 13 colonies were all planning to get together and go against the British and claim their independence, they issued the Declaration of Independence, formally saying that we're breaking away from Britain. Before all of the colonies would come together, the southern colonies wanted to be sure that the institution of slavery was protected, or they wouldn't sign the Constitution, making a United States of America. The southern slave states, who could, their whole way of life, and I'll talk about that a little later, their whole way of life was centered around the slave trade. And you can imagine that in industry, the southern states were farmers. That was the main industry. Started out with sugar in the Caribbean, sugar and rice, and eventually it exploded with tobacco and cotton as well. But farming, it was very, very labor intensive, as it still is now. It's a very labor intensive process. Back then, even more so. So you can imagine if you have an industry that's labor intensive and you have free labor, how much money you can make.
There you go. And I'm gonna put a pause on, because this all is coming together. I've got 6 different questions coming off the board, so I want to let our listeners know that we're watching what they're saying, and we're going to open up the phone lines so they can call and talk to you directly as well. But there are several points that have been brought up. One, someone asked about Black Wall Street and other Black Wall Streets, which is one. Number 2, Seneca Village and other Seneca villages. There's also, I'm just giving you a representation of where these questions are going.
Yeah, I see where you're going. Yeah.
And there's also a direct question with regard to Willie Lynch and when that law happened. And also, this is a question for me. I would like you to lead off with this one, because you're talking about free labor. You're talking about agriculture and grow, and the slave masters weren't paying for the labor. So now I want to lead into this, because it is not widely known in our historical community that the slave masters were actually paid reparations in some cases when they were forced to free their slaves. So I want you to actually speak on that one as well. But out of all 6 questions that I just posed to you, or positions that I just posed to you, you can take whichever one you want and run with it, and then we'll keep kind of dipping in. So let's kind of start with the Seneca villages, the Black Wall Streets, the others.
Yeah.
And then
that all kind of ties into what I talked about earlier with regards to Black people after the oppression of slavery, how we really stood on our feet and started to really progress, like pretty rapidly. You figure that, the Civil War ended, late 1860s. You had the slave amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which, abolished slavery, gave Black people, equal protection under the law, with the 14th Amendment and the right to vote. Almost right away, we started making progress, almost right away. And as you might imagine and this is pretty interesting. I'm glad I'll answer this one first, because I did want to touch on this, because this might be the time to do it. At the time of the Emancipation Proclamation, okay, we're free, Black folks are free. The question was two-sided with all these now millions of free Africans. For the white people, it was like, what do we do with all these Africans now, who we see every day walking around in our town, who we used to own and have total control over, but now the law is telling us that they're free and they are now our equal. Mm-hmm. That was very unsettling to white people, particularly Southern white people. Well, like I said, maybe a month or so earlier, we were their property, and now we were looking to be looked at as their equal. Mm-hmm. So not only did white folks didn't really know what to make or to do with us, we didn't really know what to do with ourselves coming out of slavery.
I can imagine, with all of that conditioning that we had, it must have been very difficult to balance all of it.
Exactly. We were on our own. We had depended on the slave masters for food, clothing, shelter, medical attention. And we did get medical attention. One of the things that might be lost in terms of slavery in America is that slaves are very expensive. Mm-hmm. Slaves are very expensive. By today's dollar, a strong, hard-working, productive Black male slave could cost anywhere in today's dollars from $30,000 to $40,000. Mm-hmm. Slaves were expensive. So you hear people like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and some of the large plantation owners. Those were like the Bill Gates of their day.
That's interesting.
If you owned that many slaves, you were filthy rich. The slaves were very, very expensive.
Okay, let's look at the Willie Lynch thing. When did that law happen? The old Willie Lynch law.
As far as dividing
the separation and the
well, that was that's been an old ploy. And I mean, there was a lot of ways they tried to keep us enslaved and under their control. And I mentioned, the separation by language. Mm-hmm. from the time they were captured and getting on the boat in Africa, we were separated by language. So it was all very systematic. Mm-hmm. So the idea was to turn Blacks against Blacks in any way possible. You heard the stories of, house slaves versus field slaves. Mm-hmm. So you hear all of that going through history, and there were, things to keep us under control in terms of, public punishment, public lynchings, doing really terrible things to Black folks if they ran off, when you find them cutting off a foot, and doing all of these sort of things publicly, whipping the men, in some cases emasculating them in front of people as a way of, just the slavery in this country was so brutal compared to what slavery had been historically throughout the globe, mm-hmm. that it's, you can't really compare the two. Mm-hmm. You really can't compare the two. But the answer, so I can answer one of your other questions with returns to Black Wall Street. It all has to do, again, with what we talked about earlier, is that Black folks were progressing. And in the late 1800s and late 1800s and early 1900s, coming out of slavery, there were two kind of trains of thought. This is one of the things I find really interested in studying history, and I want to look into this even some more myself. You had on the one hand black people saying, "Okay, what are we going to do now?" And you had black leaders during that time, just as you do now, black activists. You had on the one hand Booker T. Washington, who I'm sure a lot of people may be familiar with. He was a strong black leader among African American activists. He was born into slavery in Virginia. He did go to Hampton University. He established Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, and his belief was this, and this is where he was trying to steer the newly freed black slaves. His thought, particularly with the establishment of Tuskegee Institute, was that if we could come together through education, learn a trade, learn a vocation, we can take care of ourselves, even under the confines of Jim Crow. Let's just band together, get our own stuff together. And he was almost talking, in a way, certain degree of segregation. Mm-hmm. And he was pushing for economic independence, even within the confines of Jim Crow. He thought his thing was, let's get together. He gave a speech in 1895, which the people opposing his way of thinking called the Atlanta Compromise, because they saw him as almost a sellout. As him saying, we'll put up with the nonsense, but over time, just by being self-sufficient, we're going to grow our own businesses, we're going to grow our own communities, we'll have our own farms, and eventually the white men will have to recognize and accept us on their terms, which even at that time it was economically. Mm-hmm. So that was the position of Booker T. Washington. He advocated for incremental change. Let's get our own stuff together, and from there we'll work our way up to economic self-sufficiency. And at some point in the future, that'll pay off.
And you saw
that start to happen. You saw that start to happen when various cities
started building. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, they started building. Tulsa, Oklahoma was a booming town. Mm-hmm. And that's where you get the Black Wall Street. That's where it happened at the Greenwood district in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where you had banks, hotels, a thriving middle upper class black community.
Why is that the most popular one that everyone talks about when there are others? Why is it we do not hear about the others in the course of history?
Because that was probably one of the biggest and one of the most brutal, just total decimation. Mm. They totally decimated that town. That's one of the reasons. The other ones, there was killings, there were lynchings, there were things, but this one was pretty much the complete town, that area where black people were thriving, not just living, they were thriving.
And when you take into
was pretty much wiped out.
This wasn't that long ago. It wasn't that long ago.
No, 1920, 1921.
Yeah. There are people still alive from this.
No, there are people. Yeah, there are people who can still remember or have heard their mothers or fathers tell them stories about it, what happened. But yeah, they left like 9,000 black folks homeless. 400 square blocks were burnt down and destroyed and looted by white folks who were jealous of seeing black people living better than them. 150 businesses, including hotels, anything you can imagine that a thriving city would have. They had that in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in what's called the Black Wall Street area.
And they say copying is the highest form of flattery. You would think that because we're emulating them, they taught us what to do, and now we're actually doing it. They're angry. So here's what I'm going to do, Aaron, because this is good. I mean, I'm seeing so many things on the board. Gary, you can call in. For our audience, the number is 908-242-6234. Once again, 908-242-6234. The number is flashing on your screen as well. You can call in and talk to Professor Howard as well, because as you see, he's willing and he's a wealth of information, and he's definitely willing to speak to you. And
absolutely,
I prefer to.
And I don't know how. I don't have all the answers, but I can give you what I have, though, and what I do know, because there's a lot. we have a great history. We really do. When I say we, as American history.
Yes.
And, I don't say necessarily Black history because we're intertwined from the very beginning with American history. And if it was only taught properly and fully and truthfully to not only Black kids, but white kids growing up, we wouldn't have a lot. I believe we wouldn't have a lot of the issues that we have today.
Of course
if people
not.
really knew the real history.
Because it would have been understood. And here's something that we say at Boardwalk Global Media, because our illustrious leader, Charles Smith, always says, I am going to celebrate this country because we as Black people are older than the United States.
Absolutely, we are.
We've been here for over 400 years, and the United States Constitution, as we know it, is only 256
250, yep.
years old. So we're older than the United States. We have every right to celebrate the 4th of July. This 4th of July, I heard that on internet they had the blackout. No, we're not blacking out the 4th of July because it's we're protesting, and we have the right to that flag. We died and bled for that flag.
We built this country as much as any white guy did, as much as any white man did.
Whew.
We built this country from the very beginning. The thing that made America, we're a young nation, 250 years old. You look at the European countries, they've been around since for centuries. For centuries. The United States is only about 250 years old, and we're the dominant power. We became a dominant power very, very quickly for a couple of reasons. Number one, we took off economically. We became a very rich country very, very fast, and we became rich off the back of free labor. That's how we became rich. Another reason why we took off is because we had superior arms, superior weaponry, and that's how we were able to decimate the native Indians so quickly and easily. They didn't really stand a chance with bows and arrows, and we're shooting guns and cannons.
I have to interrupt you there. What is your positioning on this? Because Christopher Columbus, who did not discover America, but that's a whole nother show.
Absolutely did not.
He came here and wrote in his journal, and these journals and documents still exist to this day, that there were Black men here with the natives.
Yep. That's great you mentioned that too. Yeah. When they came over, they found Black people here. And in fact, when we talk about pre-Constitution, what the role of Black people was, in Mexico, there was one of the largest civilizations in the Americas was in Mexico, called the Olmecs, Olmecs, I think it is. And you've probably seen pictures of them. You see those huge, 10, 15-foot sculptures of heads with Black features, with, big lips, flat noses.
Yes.
That's in Mexico. And they clearly depict Black people. And that is going back BC. That's going up. The Olmecs were, the civilization ran up to 400 BC in Mexico with Black people. Some of the carvings on those ancient headstones and artifacts, you find the same carvings and the same thing in West Africa.
Wow. So we've been walking the earth for a while.
We've been here. And like you said, Columbus got here and saw Black people as they were doing the westward migration in search of gold and the gold rush. They were shocked when they got to California and they saw Black people there in the 1849 gold rush. If you look at Hawaii, the last Hawaiian queen, if you look at a picture of her, she's a Black woman.
And we have
She's
a call
Black woman
on the line, Professor. Hold on one second. Who do we have, Rocky? You're calling
Hello?
ESP Speaks?
ESP Speak. This is the great Uncle Lazy Lays.
Hi, Lays. How are you?
Come on, man. Come on, ESP. This is what we do.
Uncle
here.
Lays. Yes, darling. Uncle Lays from the Raw Perspective and OSG in the morning emails. And what else you got? He's got 6 shows. He's the hardest working man on the internet. I have a very special guest on the line with you, Uncle Lays. We have Aaron
Come on,
Howard.
Hello,
Hey,
hello.
Aaron.
How are you?
I'm great, Aaron. How you doing?
I'm doing good. So I appreciate you calling in and checking in with us today. And I hope I can answer your question. I'm gonna do my best.
So, Uncle
All
Lays,
right,
you got to
well,
turn down your volume on your phone, though, Uncle Lays.
Is my volume up a little loud?
Yeah, that's where we're getting the muffled reverb. There you go. Now you're great. Okay, go. I'm gonna shut up now. Floor is yours.
Okay. Well, listen. Let me just say one thing, I was
Lays, did he get caught off?
Uh-oh.
I think we lost. He's probably driving, because we all listen to
Right,
each other.
exactly.
He's
That's
on our
probably what it
network, so he's one of our shows, one of our hosts on one of our shows, and we all kind of band together. And I'm sure he heard you.
Oh,
And
gotcha.
all right,
Yeah,
so
you're right. He's probably moving around.
yes, but he works with a set of principles on a show called OSG. It's actually a whole conglomerate of principles, and that's something that I want to lead to with all of this historical information as well. How do we integrate this into, if we were to rewrite the history books to make them pliable to teach right now, how do we integrate all of this information into the history books? How do we let our children, all children, black, white, yellow, pink, and green, know that this is out there? Because it's interesting to everyone, whether they want to know it or not. They should know it. So what do we do? Where do we go
Everybody
from
should know it.
here?
This is our history. This is the history of this nation. And the way we're teaching history now, it's really not surprising that little white kids grow up into adults, white adults, thinking that black never did anything in this country.
Mm-hmm.
And that we've just been free since 1865, and why the hell are we doing better? Because they never learned that every step of the way we've been kicked and given roadblocks, because people never learned that. So it really does us a disservice, and it does. I think it does white people a disservice too, not teaching the real history.
So you don't think that they
And
teach
that's
their
one of the reasons why
families?
you got the issue where it is now. I'm sorry?
You don't think that they talk amongst themselves in their own families as to what grandpa did and how many slaves your great grandfather owned and how we did this? And they have to have a sense of where their wealth comes from and how it was made. I can't believe that they don't talk about it amongst themselves, Aaron.
I know we as black people talk about it. I gotta think they do, but as you see, they won't admit to it, and that's the white, I call it white pride, that they won't admit to any wrongdoing, and that's why we can go back to voting, and we can go back to the progressive agenda that was quickly implemented in South Carolina and Louisiana, and some other southern states, is that if we take over local school boards, we can, because the history book companies will write the history that prevailing districts tell them to write. They pretty much follow a guideline. For instance, and I'll give you an example. There was some talk a few years back. Texas, the biggest state, they have the biggest they're the biggest public school operation in the country, is the Texas School Board, the Texas Board of Education or Department of Education in Texas. They are very influential in what textbooks are written by the big textbook companies, because what Texas buys for their public schools, which is more than anybody else, including California, pretty much will ripple across the rest of the country.
Okay. There
was debate on how they were even going to water down our history even more than it is now by saying, getting together, the Middle Passage and bringing together black people on the slave boats and, 1 out of every 5 of them dying on the trip. They were pretty much just talking about, and at the ready to produce school history books saying black people came over here from Africa seeking jobs and a better way of life.
Wow.
So it can go to that extreme if we're not careful. and how history is taught.
Well, when you have idiots like Kanye West talking about slavery doesn't exist and jumping on board with that silliness, I mean, it's ridiculous.
Guys like that really need to go away. Yeah, he got to stop.
So
He's
now,
got to stop. He's killing us. He's killing us.
let's step back just a couple of steps to the idea of them not recognizing we're in this pandemic and with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and all of these names that we have to not cease in saying, because we need something done in the legal system to address these things. But with all of these other color, whether it be Caucasian, whether it be Indian, there are other than blacks standing up now and walking with us and marching with us and doing with us and speaking out.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, something is changing where the white population is starting to wake up, or some of them at least, is starting to wake up to these things that have happened and how to address them. So if you were a leader, you're a historian, but if you were a leader, which you are, how would you guide them into where are we going? How are you guiding them into the future of coming together as one, and let's march forward and not let John Lewis's life
Gary.
be, and then Gary's coming in, John Lewis's life not be in vain with all of these things. And we have Gary D on the line. Gary D, you can jump in as well, because I just asked the question and trust me, he can handle it.
Oh, okay. Hey,
Period in the South, and the changes that were made following Reconstruction, particularly in the civil rights movement of the 60s, where we made big gains. I think right now is another opportunity for us to make really big gains for the exact reason that you said. People are seeing it.
Right.
People saw that guy's knee on George Floyd's neck, through telephones and the internet. All of these things now are being thrown right in white people's faces. So that's why you do see them saying, decent white folks who want to live it the way, who want to walk it the way they talk it in terms of being patriots in the U.S. Constitution and free and equal and everybody. They're seeing that, straight in their faces now that that's not the case. And that's the same thing that happened in the 60s. That's when television became popular, right around the time of the civil rights movement. So they were seeing Martin Luther King marching. They were hearing Malcolm X speeches on different Sunday talk shows.
Yes. And they were watching the dogs and the hoses and everything.
Yeah, they were seeing the fire hoses and the dogs on people, white people sitting at home at 6 o'clock watching the news. That led to, us having the gains through the civil rights movement of the 60s.
Right.
And the same thing is happening now. I think this is a time, and I just hope we don't lose momentum and not just take, decorative changes, a decorative, thing. I mean, even the little things you can say we're making progress.
Well, I don't think it's going to die down anytime soon, because it keeps ramping up. Things keep happening.
Exactly.
But Aaron, I want to stop there. And is Gary still with us?
Yeah, I'm still here.
I want you to answer Gary's questions, because Gary was hitting us on the board, so I want you to kind of focus on him. Gary, I'm so sorry. It's so nice to have you on the line. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll about that. Hi, Gary.
Hey, look, man, you're doing a great job. You a lot of great info that you're giving. I thought New York City was the largest public school system in the country, but you mentioned Texas, and I was like, and I found it interesting. But when you talk about
New York City, but the state of Texas has the largest public school operation. The state of Texas, which would be bigger than the state of New York.
Right, gotcha.
Yeah.
My question actually pertains to the Constitution. So, I know a lot of Black people have spoken about, well, in order for Black people to be really equal, rip up the Constitution and do it all over again. What are your thoughts about that?
I wouldn't say you need to rip it up. I say we got to live the Constitution.
Okay.
I say we should live it. If you read, like I was saying earlier, if you read the Constitution, I think it's an amazing document. all men are created equal, you know, and the right to vote by everybody, one man, one vote, even though it doesn't even work that way with the electoral system. But the Constitution, if you read through it, it's good. Unfortunately, though, when they say we the people, there's three in the Constitution. Like I said, it doesn't mention black people. It doesn't mention slaves. They refer to the Indians, the natives as Indians. They refer to all others, which meant the black Africans, which is us. They refer to us in the Constitution as all others. And they refer to the people, which means white people.
Right.
So it's in the Constitution. So if you really mean all people as all people, the Constitution, I think, is great.
Okay. Okay.
I think the Constitution is, and that's all we've ever really been fighting for, is equality under the law. And that's what the 14th or 15th Amendment does, is, you know, equal justice under the law. And that's all we as black people have ever wanted. We just wanted to be treated equal. And while we're fighting to be equal, we're fighting people who want to maintain white supremacy.
Right.
You know, so right away we're kind of, you know, we've got a really uphill battle. But I don't really have a problem much with the Constitution if we were really living it. And, and I'll say something else too. I've read and another document which I've looked at over the past few years is the Declaration of Independence. And again, I suggest people take a look at these documents. Mm-hmm. Declaration of Independence is a pretty short document. And that was the document that Thomas Jefferson wrote after the fighting and all the skirmishes up in Boston, Virginia, and everywhere else. They said, you know, we had it with the British. We're going to do our own thing here. We don't need you anymore. If you read the Declaration of Independence and you insert where it says people, you insert black people throughout that, it could almost tell our story with us saying this is what we need and this is why we pretty much don't want to have anything to do with you guys anymore.
That's interesting.
Okay.
Yeah, read the Declaration of Independence, because it says in the Declaration, if you're not being treated well by the government, then it's your right and your duty to abolish that government and create a new one.
That's
and
right.
And on those grounds are what they started the Revolutionary War with. So if you insert black people in the Declaration, it kind of describes us to a T.
Wow.
Because the same thing they were complaining about, we're complaining about.
We're complaining about it. Right.
That's
which is why, even the slaves looked at it like, these hypocrites, they're talking all this stuff about freedom and liberty, and they still keeping us enslaved.
That's so loaded. Woo.
So to answer the question, no, I think the document itself is really a good document if we just lived it, but we don't.
Okay.
All right. Well, no, thank you for that. I have another question, if that's okay.
Sure.
Going back to the slave trade in the beginning. So, I believe I heard you mention that there were some African, I guess, kings and queens that were involved in the slave trade. So, how prevalent was it? Like, was it a major? Was there major involvement by, I guess, African kings and queens selling their own people to the Europeans?
10 million of us.
10 million. Wow.
10 million. And they were trading us. It was trade.
10 million. Trading us for guns, textiles, cloth, finished goods that were manufactured in Europe and brought down to Africa to trade. Yeah. 10 million.
Yeah, I just want to.
Okay, we have another person on the line here.
I just want to interject real quick, Gary. Oh yeah,
that 10 million didn't all come to North America. Most of the blacks coming from Africa, of that 10 million, only about 5% came to North America. Most of them were going to the Caribbean and to Brazil.
Very true.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, coming to North America, which now the United States, it was probably maybe 1 million out of that 10 million. The rest were going to the Caribbean and South and Brazil primarily. And they were going there in such large numbers is because those places had crazy high death rates. Slaves weren't lasting long in those places. They were literally being worked to death on those sugarcane farms and rice in Brazil. Blacks were dying very quickly, so there was always a need for more.
That's
the United States population of blacks grew primarily through a lot of it through reproduction. But the slaves coming over, that 10 million number, most of them were going to South America and the Caribbean. Most were going to the Caribbean, where they were worked brutally.
Yes.
Brutally.
And the Willie Lynch thing, Gary, when you were asking about Willie Lynch earlier, Willie Lynch was sent into the Caribbean to teach them how to deal with the slaves down there as well when he was done up here.
Yeah.
I'm going to bring Rocky, because Rox has a question as well. Rock, you were trying to
No, I wanted to make a statement, Gary, that when we were being traded from, and what Aaron brought up, what the professor brought up, was that they weren't expecting the type of slavery that we entered into. It was different.
Nobody in the world knew that is slavery.
You understand what I'm saying, guy? Like, they thought that it was like the slavery that we were doing in Africa, where slaves had rights, slaves got married.
It was more indentured.
They had the right to marry. After they finished their day's work, they could go home.
Yeah.
At some point in most other slaveries throughout history, at some point you could win your freedom.
Yes.
Yeah. So I just wanted to be clear, Garrett, that the selling that we're talking about in terms of the kings and stuff, right? It wasn't.
Right.
It wasn't. They weren't selling them into the sinister situation that they ended up in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I'm sure that if they knew, it wouldn't have gone down like that.
Plantation system. We took it to a whole new level. It became the business of these United States was the buying and not only bringing them over on the ship, but once we were here, buying and selling us, having offspring and selling them. If whatever, let me see, how did they say it? A child's race was determined by the mother, which meant, as you could imagine, that whenever a black woman was impregnated by a white guy with an ounce of black blood, that was a slave. So you just had to. So it was easy. The child was still
black. And I'm so glad. I wanted to bring this up earlier because that's the second reference that you've made to the origin of a black child, and I want to just take a moment because I always find an opportunity in these type of conversations to bring this to light. There is a word as black people in our communities. I mean, all communities use it, but I hear it most in black communities, and I might get beeped out by Facebook for saying this directly. Motherfucker. I can't believe that you just beat me out. The word was motherfucker. Now, here is one of the reasons as to why, and there's no laughing matter about it, because here's one of the reasons why I detest this word. Motherfucker was originated because they had black slave men. If I, as a woman, had a 15-year-old son that had active sperm and I could procreate with this child, they would put a bag over both of our heads and he was considered a mother fucker. So as black people, we should not be using that word at all because it represents your own child. The only two people who knew, or the only person who knew that these two people were about to have sex or procreate, hopefully, was the slave owner and his slave hands. You marched in there with a bag over your head. The woman laid down with a bag over her head, and her son could have been impregnating her. And the term was coined. That boy is a motherfucker. So we need to stop using that.
Yeah, now that you told me that story, you're absolutely right. Yeah, and it makes sense, because there was large scale breeding. Mm-hmm. They stopped through the Constitution, and again, the 13 original colonies wouldn't have signed it without some protection of slavery. Mm-hmm. And part of the protection was, in fact, it's really interesting. The southern states really could have had it all, but they got greedy.
Yes. Isn't that always how it is?
Any restrictions on slavery. The northern states were trying to make accommodation. Okay, the southern slave states, if you have slaves now, you can keep slaves in those states. But as we're growing and moving on the westward expansion, no new states can be slave states. They all need to be free states. The Southern states said, "Nah, we're not going for that."
Mm-hmm.
They kind of overplayed their hand, which led to the Civil War, and they took a beating.
And on that note,
But
I have to identify our station here. You're with ESP Speaks. We're with Aaron Howard, Professor Aaron Howard, and the name of the show is Our Story in History, the things you weren't taught in school. We are a live broadcast, so please give us a call at 908-242-6234. Once again, we're here with Professor Aaron Howard, who is tearing it up with the information. All right, go ahead, Gary.
Aaron, definitely some great information.
Yes.
Thank you.
Another question that I have is, so with the Willie Lynch letter, and I guess that was done for him to, I guess, show other slave owners how to basically control your slaves. And it seems like throughout the years, it's sort of there's been sort of a, I guess it captured us mentally, where I guess a lot of the things that were done during that time, I guess it just passed down from people to people. But but I guess I just wanted you to talk about how they tried to how impactful the Willie Lynch letter was on controlling slaves in the South.
The whole existence, because we grew in such great numbers so fast that they were afraid of us.
Mm-hmm.
Right. They were afraid. Where the whole thing, they lived in constant fear, and that's one of the things you see today. They're scared of us.
Yeah,
and they've been scared of us since then. We grew in such numbers that the whole thing became how to control us, and it was done very systematically because they know in numbers we could compete with them.
Mm-hmm.
But just in terms of taking away that motivation to do something, why they did the public whippings and the public lynchings and the very systematic agenda of how to separate us and not let us conspire together to win certain rights and freedoms. That was all good. It was the slave system. That's what I said earlier. The slave system here was done so much different than what slave systems had been done through, the Romans, through biblical times.
And it exists to this day. And on that note, I'm going to have to hold you still for 1 second because we have another call coming in, Aaron.
Okay.
Caller, you're on the line.
Okay, I am back. This is such a riveting conversation.
Lace.
And it's something. It's what I speak about. I don't know. I do a webcast in the morning every day. It's called the Raw Perspective Morning Emails. And sir, you are spot on. The Declaration of Independence, when you discuss that, and I think that's something that we need to talk more about, because I actually have this conversation. I say that people, like, our beef isn't with Joe the pizza guy or the people who came through Ellis Island in 1935, escaping European tyranny.
Mm-hmm.
Our beef is with the Constitution, because the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence is a beautiful document, and the ideal of America is beautiful. It just didn't apply to us as descendants of African slaves. And I think that if we put that in perspective more and understand that there were things like equity, like they didn't allow black people to build equity in the country, which kind of set us back because they let the white guys come in and get free homes,
yep.
in the 30s and 40s, and allowed those people to build, one of the main powers, the main ways of securing your family is building equity, which is building generational wealth. We weren't allowed to do that.
Mm-hmm.
We were sort of redlined into these tenements, and when the white immigrants from Europe left the tenements, we then came in. So it's kind of, and by the way, let me just say this: I've been to Gorée Island in Senegal.
Mm-hmm.
I've been to the different houses. I saw this firsthand.
Wow.
I've been there, and I've been to the door of no return.
Mhm.
I mean, it is riveting.
That's
Yes,
what I
it is.
hear.
It is. It is. Yes.
It is painful. There was so the size of the studio that you're in, they would put like 50 people in there,
Mhm.
and then they would cram them in there. And the things that they did, I've got pictures. ESP, I can show you.
I've been there.
Videotape of it.
I lived in Africa for
you have?
years.
Been to Doris,
Wow.
Yeah. And you can still smell them there.
You can smell
it's
it.
like,
Yeah, you can smell it. And the women's quarters where the pregnant women were having babies right in the quarters, and there was it was. I mean, I got to tell you something. The vitriol and the evil that white men, I'm going to use men first,
Yes.
have for us African Americans in this country, I think is formed out of guilt, because what they did to us is so awful that they cannot
terrible.
believe.
You think it's
terrible
formed
what they
out
did
of
to us.
guilt? You said?
Yeah, I think it's out of guilt.
I think it's formed
I
out of
think it's-
fear, but
And
okay.
I think out of in fear, you bring up a good point too. I was going to say out of greed.
Yes,
They lost their
definitely.
gravy train with us.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
They lost their gravy train with us. They were
Yeah.
the South in particular was like booming. I mean, globally, not just compared to the North, but I mean compared to England, Spain, Italy. I mean, the South, the Southern states, through the institution of slavery, they were making everybody rich.
That
The
goes to
economy
my
was
other point.
booming.
So
That
gentlemen,
goes to my other point.
Gentlemen, I have
Go ahead,
I'm
Dee.
having a moment here because I have 4 of my favorite men. I have Gary D on the phone, which is one of my co-hosts on one of my shows. I have the Supreme Leader, Rock Logic, sitting in front of me, and I have Lays, Uncle Lays, who forget it. And then I have Aaron Howard, which I'm not going to tell you the depth of what this man means to me. So I have all of the men.
We call that a good foursome in the golf world. That's a good foursome.
I have all of these men who are significant in my life and strong men of color. So I ask you this. With all
Yeah.
of the history that we've gone through, with all of the things that we've lived through as a people, with everything that has happened to us, with everything that's happening to us right now, what do we do next?
Well, let me jump into my second point. This is my second point when we talk about reparations. So I have a list of all of the people that got money from the Blackfoot Indians to all the different people, the Japanese, the Jews,
Yep.
everyone. But let me just say
Including
this about,
slave owners. I think in Maryland and D.C.
Yes.
got paid.
Yes,
Right.
they got
Yeah.
reparations.
they got money. They
Yep.
got reparations. But here's what I would say. If I were to try this case, I would take the emotion out of the case and try the keepers of the Constitution based on them breaking the law. Very simple. Are we human? Yes, they are human. Do we have inalienable rights to pursue health? And did we have that? Did we have those rights? No, we did not.
Nope.
Did you make money off the efforts of the great grandparents of these people? Yes, we did. So how much? And let's quantify it in a numerical value based on what's happening today, based on inflation and everything. So then I know that the owner of BET came up with a number of $14.7 trillion
Woo!
for the African American community.
And that's still not
I
enough.
think they give us that much money.
Yeah.
Still
But
not
listen, they're
enough.
throwing trillions out just for they. That's what.
You okay, Lays?
Yeah, I'm good.
All right.
Yeah.
They're throwing trillions of dollars out to stem a virus, and at this point, the
Yep.
gold doesn't back the dollar anymore. And at this point, giving you $1 trillion is giving you some X and O's, ones and zeros on a computer program. So at this point, money doesn't mean much.
Hmm.
But what the point I'm making is, I think that at this point now, I think we need to try that case based on the facts that we have, and stop trying to get white people to like us.
Yeah.
I think if we're allowed to build equity as a community, I do feel that they have to respect us, because every group that came through They were able
That's
to
what
build
they did.
equity. That's they built
And that's
equity.
what I mentioned too with Booker T. Washington. That's where he was going.
Yeah.
That's where he was going. Like, let's separate. Let's build our own where they're going to have to respect us. And, you know, he was one voice. And I'm going to throw out another name that I know all of you heard. W.E.B. Du Bois.
Yes.
You Du Bois, yeah. Absolutely.
He was another prominent black activist who had another train of thought. He was saying, we're not going to give or accommodate white folks at all. We're going to go right in the face of white supremacy, and we're going to try them through the court of law as free and equal. And that is the route that we took as a people. Generally, when you look at history, we pretty much took the track of the NAACP in saying that we're going to use the Constitution and we're going to fight for our rights and equality in court. And I guess I could, look at that and ask you all, how's that working out for us?
Well,
And,
I think the approach came because even if you look at civil rights versus equal rights, I mean, we were just asking, like somebody told the joke, that we were just asking them to be civil. Like, hey, baby,
Right.
could you not hose me? Could you not set the dogs up?
You're right.
I just want to be able to have lunch at this lunch counter. but the Pentagon even had.
We didn't. Let's not say we don't ask for much. We just want to be
Right.
equal. Just don't beat us up and kill us.
But
That's all we've been asking for.
gentlemen, why are we still asking? Why are we not taking?
Good question.
That's a great question.
Why
That is
are
a
we
great
not taking?
question.
We're now listen. We're not freshly freed slaves that are trying to emulate what we've been taught. We have been out for a long time. We have lived inside of their systems. We've lived inside of their buildings. We can build. We've gone to school. We've
Yep.
built our own schools. We've been taught
Yep.
how to use the money. Why are we not applying this on a day-to-day basis to control our communities and taking
ESP,
what
I
belongs
I
to
have
us?
a question.
I love that.
I have
That's
an
a good
answer.
question.
Why do we? A question to your question, ESP. Why do we care what they think?
I don't care what they think.
A year.
Wait,
wait,
Uncle
let-
Lays,
let- let-
I don't
let me-
care what
let
they
me-
think.
let me
I
tell you
said,
what I
why
mean.
aren't we doing what we need
Yep.
to
No,
do?
no, but we are in a sense.
I'm listening.
$1.5 trillion in spending power every year. This is 42 million African Americans. We are 13% of the United States population, and we are more wealthy than most.
To most nations. Yeah.
Than most nations. Exactly. The welfare state in the United States is 38% African American. So 38% of 42 million people is about 15 million people that are on the government handout. But on the white Americans, they're 39% or 38.5% when there's 220 million white people. So that means that's about 60 to 75 million white people on the dole. So we not only are we not a burden to society, we're actually spending more money and building up the economy. If we took the African American dollar out of the economy,
Oh,
this
gosh, forget
economy
it.
would collapse.
But this is what I'm
Exactly.
saying. Lays, this is what I'm saying.
We don't.
For everything that you say, I go check. But the African American dollar still stays in its community for only 24 hours. We need to stop that. We're still spending our dollars on their merchandise, in their stores, on their crap. We need to stop that. We're still going to
we
their
should.
businesses. We're still eating their food instead of controlling our land and controlling our food and buying and building our communities. We need to stop that. We also
If you look at
go ahead,
I'm sorry.
Aaron. No.
No,
It's
I'm
okay
just saying-
because we're of one household.
yeah, no,
You speak.
I agree with you because if you look at the success and if you look at us as immigrants, even though we didn't come here as typical immigrants, if you look at the other immigrants, that's how they became successful. They came in, they got in their own community, the Italians, the Irish, the Germans, and built themselves up economically where they brought themselves to the point where they could then go out into the rest of the world and sit at a negotiating table on equal grounds, as opposed to, as you're saying, asking for help. So we can do it economic. In this country, I see the success has been gained two ways from since this country was formed and even before it was formed, either through violence or through economics. That's how historically people in this country have gotten what they wanted.
Gentlemen, please don't misunderstand me. Once again, I respect all parties on the line right now, and you're like big brothers and little brothers to me. Your thoughts mean the world to me, but you are our leaders. You know what? My brother Lays did a show a couple of weeks ago, and he was very specific, and I took this away from it. He was very specific in stating the black man is the shield. He's the one that covers us. I, as a woman, come up with an idea. I may propagate the idea within the household, but it's up to him to protect the entire household. It's up to him to provide for the entire household. So I'm the sword and he is the shield. That's what I took away from that. So as a sword who's ready to fight and defend and hold you guys up, what do we do?
Well, we are doing it. The problem is, J. Edgar Hoover said this, and I thought this really kind of summed up everything about the white man in America. He said that the biggest problem for the United States would be if the African American, or he called us the Negroes, that was the terminology back then, the Negro would get together and unite. If the Negro united, that would be the end of America as we know it. That came from J. Edgar Hoover.
Yep.
So when
that's
we
the
say,
fear. That's the fear.
That's the fear. And vitriol, because we are superheroes, we are better. No race of people could have taken the amount of abuse that we've taken and turned it around. And listen, and let me explain something to you. It's literally the foot on the neck is definitely a great analogy of how they treated the black male. This is not so much the black women, because yes, they that's a separate argument in a sense where they really mistreated the black woman in this country. But the black male, they knew that they had to keep the foot on the neck and emasculate the black male in order
humiliate him.
And humiliate him, yeah. So we're in recovery in a sense where, in spite of all of these things that they've done, and could see what they don't tell you is the inevitability of our strength. Our strength, our victory is inevitable. There is no way they can win. At the end of the day, and this, if you want to play the long game, all right, we may not fix it in the 60s, and we couldn't fix it in the 70s, and we're still having issues with it in the 80s and 90s and the 2000s. But let me tell you something. It's inevitable if over the next 60 to 80 years, if they would rather burn this thing down than have to give it over to us. But they
and
can't.
That's what we're saying today.
Yep, exactly.
We're gonna bring Rock in here.
Byproduct of Barack Obama. Go ahead.
Yep.
We're gonna bring Rock in.
He's absolutely right. Who was that? Who was just on the phone? He's absolutely right.
Yeah,
Yes,
That's what we're saying. I mean,
and I think one of the things
we didn't get where we are today by accident. You can see it leading to this.
We didn't.
And then let's put it in perspective, really, right? And the deal is this, and this is kind of what Les is saying, but I'm just going to say it cold. What you have to understand is the black American is chronically mentally ill.
Yes.
Chronically.
Yes.
Because we still do things and think like slaves.
Mm-hmm.
You understand what I'm saying?
That's just a bit of number on us.
Right.
It really
so,
did.
So, and let me the trauma of it, right? So, like, just to make it sort of simple, right? In my point of view, okay. As an EMS worker, right? If I go to a black home, the black family is standing around the body, waiting for us to come save this person. When I go to a white home, the white people are doing chest compressions trying to save themselves.
And have a defibrillator.
You know what I'm saying?
Wow.
So that analogy makes you understand how powerless we are
Yep.
because we are chronically ill. And we do this all the time. I mean, that whole thing where I got to look better than this person and I want to look better than
That's
that
it.
person. That came out of
Yeah.
when we first came out of slavery and we started dressing nice and going to church, right? Well, I want to look better than Mrs. Jones. And I want to,
That's
and
it.
then the beat down of the black man, right? The beat down of the black
Yep.
man during slavery, that mentality is still prevalent to this day. And the big one is our mistrust of each
Each other.
other.
That's it.
Because, and that is a direct remnant from slavery. So
Yes,
here's the deal.
absolutely it
If we're going to change this thing, right, we got to change the mindset, right? We got to go, you know what? Because, and this is one person at a time, but you got to acknowledge it, right? Because I had to acknowledge that I was sick. I had to acknowledge that I was chronically ill. I had to go, you know what? I'm chronically ill. Why do I not trust my brother? Which is why you always hear me say the term, hey, what's up, black man? You good? Nah, nah, nah. You know what I'm saying? And that's how I address, matter of fact, that's how I address everybody, really.
Yes, he does. Even white men.
But it's like,
Okay.
straightforward. I do it all the time. And people look like, yo, what's up? I'm like, you don't get it. You don't understand the history. But the deal is this. I had to learn to trust other black men, to trust other black males. You understand what I'm saying? I
You had to learn to trust
Yeah.
yourself.
and then I had to learn to trust myself.
And then you can't trust your
Yeah.
woman, but that's another
right?
story
To
either.
understand that I was even capable of doing great things. So on this phone line that we have here, right, are the few that have escaped or can acknowledge that that mentality exists and we fix it. And one time Lade said something to me that was so powerful, and it was years ago. He said, Rock, if you can't look at yourself and be self-critical, right, then you see what I'm saying? He was like, I look at myself every day and try to better myself.
Right.
And I'd never done that before until he told me that. I just kind of moved through life like, oh, I just moved through life. And then it was like, well, when I say these things, how does this affect people? When I do these things,
Yes.
how does this affect people? When I come late, how does this affect things? You understand what I'm saying? And then I became
Right.
self-critical to make myself a better person along to affect other people. So until we really acknowledge...
It's an unwind, Rock. It's an unwind, and you have to understand. We have to take in consideration. We have to feather the reality of a systematic oppression, and it's almost to the point where we can call it a systematic oppression. But one thing we didn't realize is that we're actually the system.
Yes.
We are the
Yes.
system because the
Yeah.
system
Bravo,
is just
get it,
nothing
get
but a boogeyman. Right.
There you go.
Yeah.
So,
Great
point.
Powerful.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, so,
we're
so-
perpetuating it ourselves.
That's it.
right. So, we just have to know this and understand our power. Like I continue to tell everybody that we are black men in America. We are superheroes. Black women in America, we are we're like demigods of the old Ethiopian and Greek demigods from Egyptian demigods. Like we are super powerful individuals. You even have the energy. That's why sometimes two black men can't sit in the same room together and just communicate because their power is so big they can't even understand how to manage their power. So what we have to now do is figure out how to manage our power and put it to use without broadcasting it, without putting it like. And this is one thing. Like, listen, I believe in the demonstrations and the marchings and all those things that we used to do in the '60s because that was the tool provided to us. Now it's 2020. There's got to be a new game plan. There has to be a better way.
Yeah.
And we are so
Yeah,
much
we
more
should be
well
tired of marching
equipped
by
as
now.
well. Ah, gentlemen.
Because we're announcing the plan. We're announcing the plan. We're giving the plan away. Where when Trump won the election, people didn't know he won the election because it was done by a wink.
Yes.
Because everybody that was going to vote for Trump didn't say. That's why the polls were wrong.
Yep.
And they winked. And they said, we're going to get this guy in office because you know what? We can't have no niggas
No
running
more.
this country.
No more. It scared the hell out of people.
It's scared. And Barack Obama is not even a traditional African
No,
American.
he ain't even no tough guy either. No, I mean, you can't get more pleasant than that guy.
He's definitely
Right.
he's definitely no B-boy.
All right.
No.
Like
So,
Michelle
gentlemen.
Obama is the gangster. Michelle
So
Obama is the
yes,
gangster.
I'm glad you
Right.
said that. Thank you very much,
Yeah,
lady.
she's far more hood.
Yeah, she's from slavery. She's the one.
100.
Barack Obama's father is from Africa, and his mother is a white woman. And he doesn't have he couldn't even get reparations if they gave it to us because he wouldn't qualify.
He wasn't here because he wasn't here.
Right.
But that was so much that it scared them so much that they would put an unqualified, narcissistic sociopath in the office, and they would kill hundreds of thousands of their own.
Still doing it
before they would put a qualified black person back in that.
You know what they call that?
Dirty job, and they say it'll take a dirty guy to do it.
You know what they call that the next day, y'all? They called it the white lash.
The white lash.
That's what they called it the very next day.
They certainly did. Yeah. They certainly did. Well, once again, you are watching ESP Speaks with special guest Aaron Howard and a whole host of guest hosts on the line with us right now. And this is starting to sound like we need a part 2. I am enthralled and exhilarated with the way this show is going, but we are pushing 2 hours, gentlemen. So I am going to have to tie this up. This is phenomenal.
Hey, Aaron, it was a pleasure talking to you, brother.
Hey, it was a pleasure being here. And I was going to say, if you want to invite, I hope to get an invitation back, and I will certainly accept.
Aaron, honey, I'm going to do a whole nother show for you with you, Lays, and Rock alone. And he's got a whole fleet of people, which I'm going to connect the two of you so he can talk with you, because he's got a couple of wonderful things going on that I think that you can be integrated into as well. Uncle Lays, thank you so much. You know I love you to life.
Thank you. Love you too, ESP. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Raw perspective, inspirational.
I got you. Gary D, you know you're my boy, baby. You know you're my boy. So listen, let me tie this up. Let's hear our show lineup, because on Fridays, as Uncle Lays is talking about this, you can catch him at about 6:10 to 6:15 every morning. Uncle Lays does the morning emails. Very informative. You kind of float with him. You do your yoga, you get up, you do your meditation, and there's Uncle Lays on Facebook Live. Come and join us. It's a wonderful show, and it gets your juices flowing, your mind flowing, gets your day going. And on Friday nights at 6 p.m., he has another show called The Raw Perspective. That's at 6 p.m. He does all kinds of subject matter, but he then rolls into us at 7 p.m. where you can catch us on The Real Discussion with Rock Logic, Gary D, ESP, and Robin. And we're a whole nother bunch of crazy idiots doing all kinds of things. We did Jeopardy last night, had a great time. Then we roll into Saturday morning at 10 a.m. where you can get healthy and get another perspective on your health with the Fresh Start Focus with Tanya Hazelhurst Dawkins, otherwise known as TD Lovin'. She's on iHeartRadio and WDBR, so you can catch her. We roll again into 6 p.m. that night, and you have ESP Speaks, which is what you're watching and listening to right now. Thank you very much for the hand clap. And then we take you into Sunday morning. And on Sunday morning, you have Sunday morning emails with Uncle Lays. He plays a little gospel flavor so you can get that Sunday morning vibe going. That's around 8 o'clock, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock in the morning. How much?
7 a.m.
7 a.m.
Because we want.
And you get your gospel vibe on, because at 7 a.m., that rolls right into 8 a.m. with my boy, Pastor Leo. And you can catch Pastor Leo on ihpfwc.org. Once again, that's www.ihpfwc.org. And that's Pastor Leo at IHP Worship Center. On Sunday afternoon, we roll into One Nightja. This is Rock Logic with Sandrea Coleman and Stan Morse on the One Nightja Show, where we discuss all of the issues happening in New York City with the Nightja Corporation and what's happening with everything else in the city as well. So those are all of the shows that fall under the Boardwalk Global Media.
It's like a network, don't it?
It is a network.
And we call that the podcast power block weekend.
Uh-oh.
Yeah.
So that's every week. So we're going to put all of that information on the website on ESP Speaks at facebook.com. Once again, for the upcoming shows, for the real discussion this week, we're going to play Name That Tune at 7 p.m. on Friday. That's going to be a lot of
Dad
fun.
wants to play that.
Then on ESP Speaks.
Ladies, you can't play.
On ESP
Hello?
Speaks next week, 6 p.m. ESP Speaks on Saturday. I have another fire show for you. This one was terrific, but I got another fire show for you. And this is important. Here's the title: Back to School, Anxiety 101. I've got several principals. I've got several vice principals. I've got several teachers. I've got staff from the lunchroom. I've got staff from the maintenance. They are former and current DOE employees, and we're not using any names, but they're going to tell you what the hell they think is going on, because we are sending our children into a petri dish. I said this at the beginning of the show. We released prisoners at the beginning of COVID out of 8-foot by 8-foot cells. We let them out of prison, but you want us to send our babies to stand in a 6-foot by 6-foot box while you try to teach them? How are they going to the bathroom? Where are they going to lunch? Are they going out for recess? What's happening here? Guys, think. We got to get on track with this. Your kids are being sent back into these buildings. And by the way, if you're in New York City, by August 7th, if you have not gone and contacted your school and told them you want your child to do remote learning, you will be subject to sending your child to school. So please get on board. I've given you the whole rundown. This is ESP Speaks. I thank you, gentlemen. This has been a fabulous, fabulous, fabulous show. Rock, do you have any final words? And Aaron, we're going to tie up with your final words as well.
Yeah, on the One Night Show this week, we have Cynthia Tibbs. She's one of the, she's really, first of all, wonderful TA president in her building, a wealth of information. So you want to tune in to One Night Show this weekend. And that's all I really have to say. Tomorrow at 4 o'clock, actually, we're going on. And then I'm also speaking
at the Vigil.
At the Vigil. It's up on the Upper East Side, so they have me as the guest speaker. So I'll be out there with a microphone or a bullhorn or something. I don't know. But we're doing that on Sunday at 7 o'clock.
Okay. And Aaron, Howard, somebody's playing with something in the background. Could you mute whatever that is? Do we seriously have another call?
Real quickly.
Hold on, we got another call.
Don't worry about it.
All right, so we're not going to take that call because we're trying to tie it up. And Aaron, I'm sorry, your final words, my love.
Yeah, I'm just going to say, hey, I love what you guys are doing, and I really appreciate you having me here today. I really enjoyed myself, and if you're interested in things, I'll tell you a couple of things that I enjoy looking at. If you're on Facebook, I don't know if you're familiar with the Zen Education Project, ZINN. Like them on Facebook. You get some nice feeds about. We were talking about the Black Wall Street, Seneca issue. They post a lot of good stuff. It's a whole educational process. We talk about some of the things that you might want to institute in schools, or as I say, as a more direct route to get it done quickly is in neighborhood community organizations. Might be a way, if you can't get them into schools, but there's a way we can start teaching at least our own a good history. And a book that I certainly recommend on this topic, there's a book that was out for a lot of years. I don't know what edition it is now, probably 4th or 5th edition. There's a book called Lies My Teacher Told Me. If you're not familiar with it, get it. It has a lot of great information about the real history and the way it really went down from, Christopher Columbus up until the time we are now. So I'll leave it at that. But I really enjoyed it. And thank you all so much. I really enjoyed being on here with you guys.
Thank you so much. We appreciate having you here with us as well. This has been fabulous. And on my final note, I want you to remember this. If you're not willing to learn, no one can help you. If you are determined to learn, no one can stop you. This is ESP Speaks, wishing you grace and peace. Rocky, say goodnight.
Good night, Rocky.
You guys are great. Goodbye.
Have a good one.
Story goes, baby, now I got the flow, 'cause I know it from the start.